Hey dudes, even presidents get tired. And some of them, they were really bad at sleeping. Take Abraham Lincoln. Tall, brilliant, and basically an insomniac. He'd pace the halls, write letters at midnight, and sometimes fall asleep sitting, in a chair, fully dressed. Tonight we're slipping into the strange sleep routines of America's most powerful, from naps in war tents to midnight snacks in the White House. Because behind the speeches and history books, these guys were just tired humans, like the rest of us. If slow, weird facts help you fall asleep, hit like and subscribe, and drop a comment. What time is it for you right now? And are you the type who stays up too late thinking about everything? Now dim the lights, get comfy, and let's drift into the bedtime stories of the most tired men in history. Abraham Lincoln, the 16th President of the United States, is often remembered for his leadership during the most turbulent time in American history, the Civil War. His actions, decisions, and words are etched in the annals of history, but one of the lesser-known aspects of his life was his remarkably erratic sleep patterns. Lincoln, a man burdened by the weight of a nation divided, experienced a sleep schedule that was as tumultuous as the conflict he sought to end. His habits provide a unique glimpse into the mind of a leader, constantly working, often awake through the night, and forever troubled by the demands of his office. Lincoln's days were long, and his nights longer still. In the early months of his presidency, he was known to remain awake well past midnight, absorbed in the weighty matters of war strategy, political unrest, and the constant pressure to unify a fractured country. But it wasn't just the duties of the office that kept Lincoln awake. It was his own restless nature, a profound empathy for the suffering of his people, and the crushing guilt of the death toll mounting with each passing battle. In Washington, it became almost a routine for Lincoln to retire to the White House late at night, often alone in his study, reading letters, reviewing documents, or reflecting on his growing list of responsibilities. These sleepless hours were not merely filled with work. They were moments of deep introspection. Lincoln grappled with the constant loss of life, the political betrayal from his colleagues, and the ever-present tension of a nation on the brink of collapse. Reports from his contemporaries often described him as pensive and brooding during the day, but it was in the solitude of the evening that his true fatigue began to show. By the time he finally retired to his room, it was usually in the small hours of the morning. His personal staff and family members noted that he would often sleep only a few hours before waking with a start, ready to face another day filled with overwhelming challenges. But how did such a grueling schedule affect Lincoln? Did his sleeplessness contribute to the toll his presidency took on him physically and mentally? Some historians believe that his lack of sleep during these critical years had a significant impact on his health. Chronic fatigue, which affects decision-making and emotional well-being, seemed to plague him, manifesting in his pale complexion and gaunt appearance. It's said that Lincoln suffered from bouts of depression, which only worsened under the strain of leadership. Yet, despite the deepening toll, he rarely took time for rest or respite. His sleep patterns were erratic at best. There were nights when he would sleep for only a few hours, perhaps even less, while other times he would lie awake for most of the night, unable to find rest. Lincoln's nighttime restlessness was compounded by his constant sense of duty and his inability to escape from the seemingly endless crises that demanded his attention. The responsibility of leading a country at war, making life and death decisions, and maintaining the trust of a divided nation created an environment in which true rest was a distant luxury. Was this lack of sleep a contributing factor to the physical and emotional toll Lincoln would face in his final years? His health deteriorated rapidly in the final months of the Civil War, culminating in his tragic assassination in 1865. Lincoln's exhaustion, compounded by the trauma of his presidency, was surely a significant influence on his vulnerability to illness and his eventual demise. As the war continued and the pressure mounted, Lincoln's sleep continued to be interrupted by the never-ending demands of leadership. Could these sleepless nights have contributed to his decision-making, his public demeanor, and perhaps even his eventual tragic fate? Would Lincoln have made the same choices if he had been able to get the proper rest he so desperately needed? As you consider the physical toll on Lincoln's body and the psychological strain that came with his unrelenting schedule, one must wonder, how did he endure it all? What role did his sleep, or lack thereof, play in the final decisions that ultimately shaped the end of the Civil War? As the Civil War dragged on, so too did Abraham Lincoln's battle with sleep. The weight of leadership during such a tumultuous period in American history was unparalleled. Lincoln's determination to persevere through the sleepless nights and relentless pressure was fueled by a sense of personal responsibility, a sense that he could not allow himself the luxury of rest while his nation teetered on the edge of collapse. Yet this very dedication, this deep commitment to his duty, came at a price that would manifest in ways both physical and mental. Throughout his presidency, Lincoln's schedule was erratic and filled with urgent decisions. His days were filled with cabinet meetings, reports from generals, and strategy sessions that demanded his immediate attention. When he wasn't in the Oval Office, Lincoln could often be found in the White House at night, reading over papers, reviewing documents, or writing letters. It is said that during the darkest days of the war, he was hardly ever seen without a stack of papers in hand. Even at night, his work never ceased. But this dedication to the work came at the expense of the rest that was essential for his health. On some nights, Lincoln could be found pacing around his study, lost in thought, wrestling with decisions that weighed heavily on his conscience. He spent countless hours pondering the fate of soldiers, families, and communities torn apart by the war. The constant pressure of managing a country in crisis, coupled with the ever-present news of battle losses, drove him into bouts of restlessness that extended far beyond ordinary exhaustion. Despite his physical fatigue, Lincoln's mind was in overdrive, relentlessly processing every aspect of the war and its effects. By all accounts, Lincoln did not prioritize his own health, nor did he consider sleep a luxury he could afford. His staff, friends, and even his own wife, Mary Todd Lincoln, worried about his sleep deprivation. Mary, in particular, noticed the toll it was taking on him. She saw the change in his demeanor as the war dragged on, the pale skin, the dark circles beneath his eyes, the increasing irritability, and the growing weariness that seemed to seep into his very bones. Yet, even when concerned about his physical condition, Lincoln could not bring himself to slow down. The mere thought of leaving the White House for a restful break was unfathomable to him. At times, when he did manage to slip away to sleep, it was never for long. Reports from those who cared for him mentioned that Lincoln would wake at odd hours, even in the middle of the night, driven by an overwhelming need to check on matters of state. He seemed to view his sleepless nights as a necessary sacrifice, a part of the burden he carried as president. Lincoln, in his own mind, was fighting a battle against time itself. And yet, despite the toll on his body and mind, Lincoln remained remarkably sharp in his decision-making. His speeches, such as the Gettysburg Address, continue to be studied for their clarity, depth, and vision. Even in the darkest moments, his ability to inspire the nation and maintain a semblance of hope was undeniable. But the strain of sleepless nights also had its drawbacks. Though Lincoln's ability to persevere was impressive, it cannot be denied that his lack of sleep affected his emotional well-being. His bouts of melancholy were well documented and, While some of it may have been inherent to his personality, it seems plausible that chronic sleep deprivation exacerbated his emotional state. Many close to him described moments when he seemed withdrawn or distant, unable to engage with those around him. He struggled with the enormity of his decisions, often doubting his ability to carry the country through the crisis. His sleeplessness made those moments of doubt feel even heavier, as the lack of rest only compounded the emotional fatigue he already carried. At the same time, Lincoln's sleeplessness did not go unnoticed by those who interacted with him on a daily basis. His advisors, generals, and even foreign diplomats were aware of the toll it was taking on him. General William Tecumseh Sherman, one of Lincoln's most trusted military commanders, once remarked that Lincoln's ability to function under such pressure was remarkable, but also noted that the president seemed physically drained. The war, combined with his personal struggles, had left an indelible mark on Lincoln's appearance and demeanor. Friends and associates could see that the years of sleep deprivation were slowly eroding his health. Despite all of this, Lincoln maintained his work ethic, even as it wore him down. But how long could a person continue at such a pace before the body and mind break down entirely? Was Lincoln's ability to push through this exhaustion a mark of his strength, or a dangerous sign of his inability to manage his health? It is possible that Lincoln's constant vigilance played a key role in shaping his character. His sense of duty and resolve were undoubtedly the qualities that helped him steer the country through its most critical period. But in his unwavering commitment to his country, did Lincoln ignore the very thing that might have prolonged his life and allowed him to continue his work, the need for rest? As the war drew closer to its end, so too did Lincoln's ability to sustain himself through sleepless nights. The toll of the years, compounded by his exhaustion, would soon reach its tragic climax. Could he have lived longer, accomplished more, if only he had been able to sleep more regularly, to pause, to step back and take care of himself? As Abraham Lincoln's second term in office drew to a close, the cumulative effects of his sleepless nights and relentless workload became increasingly apparent. The stress and exhaustion that had been quietly building over the years took its toll on the president's health. Yet, despite the wear and tear on his body and mind, Lincoln's resolve remained unbroken until the fateful moment when his life was cut short. It is difficult to imagine how Lincoln might have continued to navigate the complexities of post-war America, but the reality is that he was already a man on the edge. His body, weakened by years of sleepless nights, had become more susceptible to illness. His mind, though sharp and focused, bore the scars of the countless decisions, the constant grief over the war's casualties, and the personal tragedies that marked his presidency. Lincoln had become an embodiment of resilience, yet his physical health had become fragile, almost as fragile as the nation he had fought so hard to preserve. The end of the war seemed to offer a light at the end of the tunnel for Lincoln. The Confederacy was in retreat, and the Union was beginning to heal from the wounds of a long and bloody conflict. The prospect of peace was on the horizon, yet Lincoln's greatest challenge, his own physical and emotional well-being, had taken a back seat for too long. In the final months of his life, as he began to rest more frequently and take brief moments for relaxation, it became apparent that the damage had already been done. While Lincoln's sleep patterns were irregular and largely non-existent during the war years, they took on a more tragic significance after his assassination. Some historians have speculated that his declining health and exhaustion may have made him more vulnerable to the emotional strain of his final days. The constant toll of grief, worry, and sleepless nights may have weakened his immune system, making him more susceptible to the flu-like illness that would ultimately contribute to his death. Yet, There is no way to know for sure whether his death could have been avoided or delayed had he taken more care in managing his health during those intense years in office. But beyond the personal implications of Lincoln's health struggles, the story of his sleep, or lack thereof, offers a deeper insight into the nature of leadership during a national crisis. Lincoln's approach to sleep, or rather his neglect of it, was a reflection of his all-consuming commitment to the country. His inability to rest was not a sign of weakness, but rather a mark of his extraordinary sense of duty and responsibility. He believed that his sacrifices were necessary for the survival of the Union, and in the face of unimaginable challenges, he continued to push forward, despite the toll it took on his body. His sleep deprivation also mirrored the reality of war itself, unceasing, relentless, and unforgiving. The Civil War was not just a conflict fought on battlefields. It was a psychological and emotional battle that consumed every facet of Lincoln's existence. The president, much like the soldiers under his command, was entrenched in a battle that left no room for rest, no space for retreat. His sleepless nights were a silent reflection of the war's unyielding demands. And in this way, his struggle for rest became emblematic of the nation's own struggles. As we reflect on the legacy of Abraham Lincoln, it is impossible to separate his personal sacrifices from the historical impact he left on the United States. His sleep habits, though seemingly trivial, were intertwined with his very essence as a leader. His ability to endure, to carry the burdens of his presidency with such resilience, was as much a part of his character as his eloquence, his wisdom, and his ability to inspire. And yet, it is also a sobering reminder of the human cost of leadership, the toll that the weight of the world can take on an individual, even the most remarkable among us. What might have happened if Lincoln had been able to rest more? Would he have lived longer, perhaps to guide the nation through the difficult years of Reconstruction? Would his health have allowed him to be more fully present for the challenges that lay ahead? These questions linger, but they serve to remind us of the frailty of even the strongest leaders. Lincoln's legacy, in many ways, is not only defined by his political triumphs and moral convictions, but also by the physical and emotional toll of his presidency. Lincoln's tragic assassination on April 15, 1865, forever marked the end of an era, and while his death was the result of an act of violence, the years of sleep deprivation, the relentless pressure, and the burden of leadership were perhaps silent contributors to the unraveling of his health. In the grand sweep of history, Lincoln stands as a symbol of resilience, a leader who never ceased to fight for his country, no matter the cost. The question remains, what is the cost of leadership, and how much of that cost is paid in the quiet hours of restlessness, in the absence of sleep, in the quiet struggles of a leader who cannot afford to rest? And what lessons can we draw from Lincoln's example as we consider the toll that leadership, responsibility, and unrelenting pressure can take on the human body and mind? With Lincoln's life and legacy in mind, it is clear that history remembers not only his victories but also the sacrifices he made. His sleep, or lack thereof, was a small yet powerful part of that story, one that offers valuable insights into the often unseen toll of leadership. This reflection on Lincoln's life provides a sobering conclusion to our story, leaving us to ponder how the lessons of his tireless work ethic and the cost of his sleepless nights might continue to resonate in the modern world. Would leaders today, in the face of their own crises, fall prey to the same exhaustion, the same weariness, or would they recognize the importance of rest before the pressures of leadership consume them entirely? Thus, as we end this tale of sleepless nights and burdens too great to bear, we're left with the enduring question of what happens when even the strongest of leaders can no longer hold the weight of the world on their shoulders. How does the absence of sleep shape history? And how might the past be different if rest had been prioritized? This marks the end of the story of Abraham Lincoln's sleep habits. Thomas Jefferson, the third president of the United States, is often remembered for his brilliance, his role in drafting the Declaration of Independence, and his visionary leadership of the early republic. However, less is known about the peculiarities of his personal life, especially his sleep habits. Jefferson's unusual sleep schedule was not simply a quirk, it was a strategic choice, a reflection of his intense drive to manage the numerous projects that occupied his life. His daily routine, and particularly his approach to rest, reveals much about his character and the demands of leadership during the nation's formative years. Born in 1743 in Shadwell, Virginia, Jefferson was accustomed to a life of rigorous intellectual pursuit from an early age. A polymath with a voracious appetite for knowledge, he dedicated himself to mastering a wide array of subjects: science, philosophy, architecture, politics, and agriculture. Jefferson's relentless quest for understanding shaped not only his public career but also his private life. The president's routine, however, was far from typical. Jefferson believed in the power of sleep, but his interpretation of it was unusual. Like many of his contemporaries, he adhered to the idea that sleep was essential for maintaining one's health. But he also had a personal philosophy that allowed him to get by with a split sleep schedule, what is today often referred to as polyphasic sleep. He would sleep in 2 separate intervals, a longer, uninterrupted rest during the early night, and then a second, shorter period in the early morning hours. This was not a practice unique to Jefferson. It was somewhat common in the 18th century, when sleep cycles were more flexible. But Jefferson's commitment to this rhythm had deeper implications. Jefferson's first rest would typically begin after dinner, around 10 p.m., and last for a solid 4 hours. Then he would rise early, around 1 or 2 a.m., to work, study, or write until the morning hours. It is said that Jefferson was often seen walking around his study in the late night hours, thinking through philosophical problems or drafting letters, a habit that helped him maximize his productivity. In the stillness of the night, he would find the peace and solitude to reflect deeply on matters of state and intellectual pursuit. However, Jefferson's schedule was not merely the result of personal preference. It was a practical necessity. His time as president demanded constant attention to affairs of the state, including correspondence, strategy, and decision-making. He was also a hands-on administrator of his many personal interests, including the management of his estate, Monticello, which required constant attention. Jefferson saw no other way to manage his various roles and responsibilities but by maximizing every hour of the day, even if that meant giving up a standard, consolidated sleep schedule. During his presidency, Jefferson was often absorbed in the details of governance, especially the challenges of navigating the country's fragile post-Revolutionary War landscape. He faced multiple foreign crises, territorial expansion, and notably, the planning and execution of the Louisiana Purchase, which would double the size of the United States. All of these responsibilities demanded not only mental clarity, but also a significant amount of personal time and effort. Jefferson's split sleep pattern allowed him to sustain the rigorous pace he set for himself, without the need for extended, uninterrupted rest. But Jefferson's sleep was not without consequences. While the polyphasic sleep schedule might have allowed him to be productive in the short term, it did little to alleviate the toll it took on his physical and emotional health. Even for a man as disciplined and committed to his work as Jefferson, the lack of continuous rest began to catch up with him. As president, Jefferson's relentless work ethic was both an asset and a burden. His ability to sustain himself on little sleep was part of what made him an effective and tireless leader. Yet, as we delve deeper into the effects of his sleep habits, we begin to ask, how did this demanding schedule impact Jefferson's mental well-being, his decision-making, and his relationships? Did the lack of solid rest undermine his physical health in the long run? Could a more regular sleep schedule have allowed Jefferson to carry out his duties with even more success and less strain? With these questions in mind, we move forward into the deeper effects of Jefferson's unique the Thomas. Jefferson's presidency was not just a political role. It was a life filled with many competing demands. In addition to overseeing the fledgling United States, Jefferson was an avid agriculturalist, a passionate architect, and a hands-on manager of his estate, Monticello. His unorthodox sleep schedule, which allowed him to extend his waking hours well beyond those of a typical person, gave him a semblance of time to address all these responsibilities, yet it also led to mounting challenges, both personal and professional. One of the key aspects of Jefferson's life that necessitated his irregular sleep habits was his management of Monticello, his beloved plantation in Virginia. Monticello was not just a home for Jefferson, it was the embodiment of his vision for America. A grand architectural project that he designed himself, Monticello was both a center of intellectual pursuit and agricultural experimentation. Jefferson used his estate to engage with the latest scientific ideas, experimenting with new crops, farming techniques, and the cultivation of a wide range of plants and trees. It was a never-ending project that required constant attention, planning, and coordination, making it nearly impossible for Jefferson to maintain a traditional sleep schedule. Monticello's operations, however, were inextricably linked to Jefferson's personal work ethic. The estate relied on enslaved labor, a reality that often put Jefferson in morally complicated situations, despite his professed ideals about liberty and freedom. His role as both a statesman and plantation owner meant that his decisions could impact the lives of hundreds of people, and those decisions, in many ways, bled into his personal time. This duality between a public life of political decision-making and a private life of agricultural management created a constant tension. Jefferson's restless nights were often spent in contemplation of both his political actions and his stewardship of Monticello. In addition to Monticello, Jefferson's presidency required him to focus on the young republic's diplomatic and military challenges. During his 2 terms in office, he faced a series of difficult foreign relations issues, most notably with Britain and France. The Napoleonic Wars were in full swing, and the United States had to navigate a delicate path to avoid being dragged into European conflicts. The Embargo Act of 1807, which Jefferson enacted to pressure Britain and France to respect American neutrality, was a particularly challenging decision. Jefferson's tireless work ethic saw him writing speeches, engaging in diplomatic correspondence, and overseeing military preparations, all while trying to balance his own health and his family obligations. But this relentless pace began to take a toll. While Jefferson's split sleep pattern allowed him to remain productive, it was clear that he was not immune to the stress of his many roles. His political enemies, for example, often criticized him for what they saw as erratic decision-making, especially in the context of the Embargo Act, which devastated the American economy and led to widespread dissent. Jefferson's inability to manage his time effectively, especially with his tendency to overextend himself, was becoming more evident. In his private life, Jefferson's health also began to show signs of strain. The demands of running Monticello, overseeing national affairs, and maintaining a personal intellectual life were immense. While Jefferson believed that his intellectual pursuits could invigorate him, they also added to his sense of isolation and fatigue. Writing in his later years, Jefferson admitted that he had become exhausted by the weight of his responsibilities. He had been a tireless optimist in his early years, But by the end of his presidency, his optimism was tempered with a weary sense of reality. The presidency had taken a significant toll on his physical and mental health. One of Jefferson's personal struggles was his ongoing battle with the demands of his family. His relationship with his wife, Martha, was strained by her early death, and Jefferson's two daughters, who lived with him at Monticello, also played a significant role in his daily life. Yet, even in the midst of personal sorrow and family obligations, Jefferson's commitment to his presidential duties never waned. He often found himself torn between his family and his public responsibilities, and sleep became an escape from the emotional complexity of both. In fact, it was during these late-night hours that Jefferson would most often find respite from the overwhelming demands of his life. His polyphasic sleep pattern, sleeping in 2 separate intervals, allowed him to stay on top of his work without feeling completely overwhelmed. But even this method of rest was not sustainable in the long run. Jefferson's chronic fatigue would begin to show in his later years. His physical health deteriorated, and his mental sharpness, though still present, began to decline. The question that lingers is, could Jefferson have achieved even more had he managed his time and health differently? Would the country have benefited from a leader who was not only intellectually sharp, but physically rested and emotionally present? Jefferson's tireless work ethic and his devotion to public service were undeniably central to the success of his presidency, but his struggle to balance these demands with personal well-being speaks to the broader issue of leadership in times of immense pressure. How can a leader manage the ever-growing demands of a nation while also taking the time to preserve their own health and sanity? As we examine the later years of Jefferson's life, it becomes clear that the burden of his presidency, combined with his personal and intellectual commitments, ultimately led to his physical and emotional decline. The challenges of managing Monticello, a nation, and his own mind, amid the constant demands of intellectual engagement and political maneuvering, were perhaps too much for any one man to carry without long-term consequences. By the time Thomas Jefferson completed his 2 terms as president in 1809, he had already left a lasting mark on the United States, but the toll of his relentless work schedule was beginning to show in profound ways. Jefferson's innovative ideas, his acquisition of the Louisiana Territory, and his influence on the early national identity of the United States were monumental achievements. However, they came at the expense of his physical health, personal well-being, and even his long-term effectiveness as a leader. After retiring to Monticello, Jefferson continued to engage in public life, contributing to political debates and fostering educational institutions, including the University of Virginia. Yet despite his post-presidential activities, the strain of his earlier years never fully dissipated. His sleep habits, which had once allowed him to balance the many competing demands of his presidency and personal life, now seemed like a distant memory, replaced by the quiet exhaustion of his aging body. Jefferson's refusal to rest, his tendency to overwork, and his relentless pursuit of intellectual and public endeavors had exacted a heavy price. The years of sleepless nights, divided sleep schedules, and endless duties had worn him down. In his final years, Jefferson's health began to seriously decline. He suffered from a variety of ailments, some of which were exacerbated by his inability to prioritize his rest. There are accounts of him being bedridden for extended periods, struggling with various physical ailments, including severe pain in his legs and joints. His fatigue was more than physical. It was emotional and intellectual too. While he had been a dynamic leader, one of the most visionary minds of his generation, the years of constant stress and lack of sleep had left him a shadow of his former self. Yet, despite these physical struggles, Jefferson continued to work tirelessly. His days remained filled with correspondence, readings, and other intellectual pursuits, but the edge of his previous vigor was gone. His physical decline mirrored the challenges faced by the young republic, which was itself transitioning into a new phase of its existence. The Louisiana Purchase was still fresh in the public's mind, and the early 19th century saw the United States solidifying its presence on the global stage. In many ways, Jefferson's era had set the stage for the country's future, but by the time he left the presidency, Jefferson had lost much of the energy that had driven him. It is difficult to ignore the impact that Jefferson's sleep habits had on his life in his later years. Had he found a more balanced approach to rest, one that allowed him time to recuperate physically and emotionally, would he have been able to enjoy a longer, more vibrant post-presidency? His declining health suggests that even the most capable minds are vulnerable to the effects of chronic exhaustion. Could he have achieved even more if he had allowed himself to rest more fully during his time in office? In reflecting on Jefferson's life, it is clear that his commitment to his country and his tireless pursuit of intellectual and political excellence shaped the very fabric of the United States. Yet, his personal struggle with sleep and the physical toll of his overworked lifestyle provide a sobering lesson about the costs of leadership. Jefferson, like so many great leaders throughout history, sacrificed his personal well-being for the greater good. But that sacrifice came with its own set of consequences. What lessons can we take from Jefferson's life as we look to our own leaders today? In a world that demands more of individuals than ever before, how can we strike a balance between the pursuit of great goals and the need for rest, recovery, and self-care? Jefferson's story invites us to consider not just the triumphs of great leaders, but also the personal toll their sacrifices take, reminding us that even the greatest minds are still human. And as we look back on Jefferson's life, it is clear that despite all the intellectual, political, and personal challenges he faced, the question remains: could his enduring legacy have been even greater if he had recognized the need for rest as a necessary part of his personal and professional growth? Would a more balanced life have allowed him to achieve even more for the young republic and for himself? The life of Thomas Jefferson stands as a testament to both the possibilities and the limitations of tireless dedication. His legacy, both as a founding father and as a man, continues to shape our understanding of leadership, sacrifice, and the inevitable toll of time. With this reflection on Jefferson's life, we now close the chapter on the relentless workdays of one of America's most brilliant presidents. Napoleon Bonaparte, the Emperor of the French and one of the most brilliant military strategists in history, is remembered for his rise from obscurity to power, his expansive conquests, and his eventual fall from grace. But beneath the grandeur of his reign and the brilliance of his military tactics lay a man who was deeply troubled by his own restless mind and sleep habits. Napoleon's relationship with sleep was complex. His lack of it, a necessary evil to fulfill his overwhelming ambitions, played a crucial role in shaping both his reign and his eventual downfall. Napoleon's work ethic was legendary. His mind was always in motion, calculating, strategizing, and planning. As a military leader, his days were filled with the most intense activities, and his nights were often short, fragmented, or completely devoid of sleep. He was known to rise early in the morning, sometimes before dawn, and work tirelessly well into the night, often without taking the time to rest. His sleep schedule was so irregular that it became a characteristic trait of his leadership. Reports from those who served him during his campaigns speak of his extraordinary capacity for sustained activity. Napoleon's usual routine involved working for hours on end, attending to matters of state, reviewing battle plans, signing papers, and managing the logistics of his vast empire. He would then retreat to his quarters, sometimes with just a few hours of sleep, if any at all. Napoleon would often take brief naps during the day to compensate for the sleep he had missed. But these were not regular or sufficient enough to alleviate the exhaustion he must have felt. One of the most notable aspects of Napoleon's sleep habits was his ability to function with very little sleep. It was said that he could manage on as little as 3 or 4 hours per night, especially when in the midst of a campaign. This lack of rest was not a choice made out of necessity alone. Napoleon was driven by a relentless ambition to conquer and control. He believed that to achieve his lofty goals, he could not afford the luxury of sleep. His mind was always racing, calculating the next strategic move, analyzing potential threats, and preparing for the inevitable battles that lay ahead. But how could someone function effectively on so little sleep? Napoleon's ability to push through exhaustion is a testament to his sheer willpower, but it also points to a deeper issue: his inability to truly rest, to stop for a moment and allow his mind and body to recover. His sleep habits were a reflection of the mental and emotional toll that came with being one of the most powerful men in the world. His leadership was driven by an unyielding desire to maintain control, and this drive manifested in the long hours he spent working at the expense of his health. His sleep deprivation was compounded by the immense pressures he faced as emperor. As Napoleon expanded his empire across Europe, the demands of leadership only grew. He was constantly involved in military campaigns, diplomatic negotiations, and the governance of his empire. His mental and physical fatigue, though masked by his extraordinary energy and ambition, slowly began to take a toll on his decision-making and leadership. Napoleon's contemporaries were well aware of his sleep habits. His aides and generals often remarked on his ability to function under such stress, but they also recognized the strain it placed on him. Some accounts from his inner circle describe him as being irritable, prone to mood swings, and occasionally, uncharacteristically, indecisive, traits that were likely exacerbated by his lack of sleep. His military successes, while impressive, were often achieved at the cost of his personal health. Yet, despite the clear consequences of his sleep deprivation, Napoleon seemed unable to stop himself. Sleep was an afterthought, a luxury he could not afford in the face of his grand ambitions. But what did it cost him? How did this disregard for rest contribute to his eventual downfall? As we dive deeper into Napoleon's tumultuous reign, we begin to see how the lack of sleep affected not just his physical health, but his leadership and decision-making. What might have happened if he had taken the time to rest, to recover, and to recharge his mind? Would he have been able to make clearer, more rational decisions? Could his sleep deprivation have been one of the many factors that ultimately led to his demise? Napoleon Bonaparte's relentless work ethic, particularly his lack of sleep, was not only a personal habit, it became a driving force behind his actions as emperor. His constant need for power and control, paired with his unwillingness to prioritize rest, created a dangerous cycle. As his empire expanded, so did the pressure he faced. His military campaigns were ever more intense, the stakes ever higher, and his sleeplessness began to exact a more visible toll. While Napoleon's ability to function on little sleep is remarkable, it is also telling of the deep personal cost he was paying. As his empire grew, so did the stress of maintaining it. He was involved in every facet of governance, military strategy, and diplomacy. Each of these areas required his full attention, but because of his inability to stop working, he increasingly found himself caught in an endless loop of exhaustion and decision-making. His life, much like the empire he controlled, was ruled by a constant push to achieve more, to conquer new territory, and to cement his legacy. Yet, as we dig deeper, it's clear that his physical and mental fatigue played a central role in some of the most critical decisions of his reign and ultimately in his downfall. Napoleon's fatigue, which stemmed from his constant lack of sleep, became apparent in the way he managed his military campaigns. One of the most telling examples of this occurred during the ill-fated Russian campaign of 1812. Napoleon, having already been on the move for months, was far from rested as he invaded Russia. The campaign was intended to force Russia to comply. With his continental system, a blockade meant to weaken Britain by cutting off its trade with Europe. Yet, despite Napoleon's careful planning and his usual brilliance in military strategy, the invasion turned disastrous. Many historians point to the toll that sleep deprivation and exhaustion took on Napoleon's ability to make sound decisions during this campaign. The immense pressures of leading an army of over 600,000 men through the freezing Russian winter, coupled with his continuous work and lack of rest, clouded his judgment. Some of his decisions were questioned by his generals, but Napoleon, driven by his usual confidence and determination, often dismissed their concerns. His lack of sleep, combined with the isolation he felt as a ruler who relied on his own judgment and willpower, left him vulnerable to making disastrous mistakes. The Russian campaign ended in catastrophe, with most of his forces decimated by the cold, disease, and lack of supplies. The effects of Napoleon's sleeplessness were also felt on the battlefield. While he was once known for his ability to strategize and adapt quickly in battle, his judgment was increasingly impaired by fatigue. In key moments, his generals observed a Napoleon who seemed less sharp, more agitated, and at times less willing to listen to sound advice. The signs of mental and physical strain were becoming too obvious to ignore. His sleep deprivation, a result of his desire to control every detail, became a barrier to his success. He simply could not sustain the energy needed to make the best decisions or to lead effectively. In addition to his military difficulties, Napoleon's relationships with those closest to him began to suffer as well. His constant need for power and control meant that he isolated himself, often keeping his thoughts and plans to himself. His inner circle, once loyal and eager to serve him, began to show signs of frustration and distrust. Even those who remained in his service grew increasingly concerned about his well-being. Yet, despite these concerns, Napoleon persisted in his relentless pace, unable or unwilling to recognize that the lack of rest was compromising his effectiveness as both a ruler and a strategist. Napoleon's sleeplessness was not merely a physical inconvenience, it was a key factor in his growing detachment from reality. As the war against Russia unfolded and his empire began to crumble, he became more unpredictable, driven not only by ambition, but by exhaustion and frustration. His decision-making became erratic, as though his mind could no longer keep pace with his desires. His once unstoppable momentum began to falter, and his health deteriorated further as he faced defeat on multiple fronts. The toll that sleep deprivation had taken on his mind and body was now painfully clear. Could the outcome of Napoleon's campaigns have been different if he had prioritized his health, if he had given himself the time to rest and recuperate? Would he have made better decisions during the Russian campaign, or avoided overextension altogether? It's impossible to say for certain, but it's clear that his constant lack of sleep, combined with his relentless pursuit of power, played a role in the eventual unraveling of his empire. As Napoleon's reign crumbled and he was exiled to the island of Elba in 1814, his physical and mental exhaustion had clearly caught up with him. Even after his brief return to power in 1815, what would come to be known as the 100 Days, Napoleon seemed to be a shadow of the man who had once conquered much of Europe. His subsequent defeat at the Battle of Waterloo and his final exile to St. Helena mark the end of his empire, and his life was an example of the high price of constant exhaustion. Would Napoleon's story have been different if he had learned to rest, to balance his unrelenting drive for success with the need to rejuvenate? His fall from power is a stark reminder of how sleep deprivation, when paired with unchecked ambition, can not only impair judgment, but also Napoleon Bonaparte's final years are a testament to the physical, emotional, and psychological toll that a relentless pursuit of power can take on an individual. His ambition and genius made him a ruler like no other, and his rise to power was meteoric. Yet, it was also marked by an obsession with control, a refusal to rest, and an unsustainable work ethic that would ultimately contribute to the collapse of his empire. As we look back on his life, it becomes clear that his sleep deprivation played a pivotal role in the downfall of the man who once ruled much of Europe. By 1814, after the catastrophic failure of the Russian campaign, Napoleon found himself facing an increasingly fragmented empire. The once unstoppable force that had swept across Europe now seemed vulnerable. His exhaustion, exacerbated by years of sleepless nights, had clouded his judgment and left him vulnerable to the shifting tides of war and diplomacy. Napoleon, now a man who had pushed himself beyond his limits for years, began to falter, and the empire he had built with such brilliance began to crumble. The Russian campaign of 1812 was one of the defining moments of Napoleon's downfall. His decision to invade Russia, despite clear warnings from his generals, was not just a strategic blunder. It was the culmination of years of sleep deprivation, poor health, and an overextended empire. The ill-fated invasion led to a humiliating retreat, with Napoleon losing nearly all of his army to the Russian winter, disease, and starvation. The toll this took on Napoleon's physical and mental health cannot be overstated. His sleepless nights, constant work, and obsession with control had led him to make one of the most disastrous decisions of his career. But even as his empire began to fracture, Napoleon did not relent. He retreated to Paris, reasserted his authority, and prepared for the next phase of his military campaigns. Yet his ability to lead with the same vigor and decisiveness was gone. His physical and mental fatigue had taken root, and Napoleon's decision-making, once sharp and calculated, was now clouded by exhaustion. His generals, who had once revered him for his insight and strategic brilliance, began to question his judgment. But Napoleon, driven by his unyielding ambition, continued to push forward, though it was clear that his ability to lead effectively was slipping away. His return to power in 1815, known as the 100 Days, was marked by desperation rather than brilliance. The final battle of his career, the Battle of Waterloo, was not just a military defeat. It was the culmination of Napoleon's inability to manage his own physical and mental health. In the heat of the battle, Napoleon's exhaustion was palpable. Reports from those who served him described a leader who was not as sharp or decisive as he had been in his earlier campaigns. His orders were disorganized, and he seemed distant, as if his mind was no longer fully present. The battle was lost, and with it, the remnants of Napoleon's empire. Napoleon's fall from power is a stark illustration of how sleep deprivation can erode even the greatest of minds. His inability to rest, his constant drive for more, and his refusal to acknowledge the toll that this relentless pursuit of power was taking on him led to the unraveling of his empire. The mental fog brought on by years of inadequate rest not only clouded his strategic thinking, but also contributed to his detachment from reality. As his empire collapsed, so too did the man who had once held Europe in his grasp. After his final exile to the island of St. Helena, Napoleon's life came to a slow and painful end. Stripped of power, and surrounded by the remnants of his past. He spent his remaining years reflecting on his life and the choices he had made. Sleep, which had once been a casualty of his ambition, now became elusive in a different way. His body, broken from years of relentless work and strain, no longer functioned as it once had. His mind, once sharp and strategic, had deteriorated under the weight of his own relentless pursuits. His years of sleep deprivation had caught up with him, and his body and mind were irrevocably damaged. In the final years of his life, Napoleon's legacy was no longer that of the invincible conqueror, but of a man who had sacrificed everything: his health, his relationships, and ultimately his empire, for the sake of power. His sleep-deprived journey was a tragic reminder of the costs of ambition when balanced against the needs of the body and mind. Napoleon's story serves as a cautionary tale, not just about the dangers of excessive ambition, but also about the human need for rest. Leaders who sacrifice their health in the pursuit of greatness may achieve remarkable success, but they also risk losing everything in the end. Napoleon's fall was not just a political one, it was a personal one, marked by the toll of sleepless nights and a refusal to acknowledge the physical and emotional consequences of his actions. Had Napoleon been able to balance his ambition with self-care, had he taken the time to rest and recuperate, might his empire have endured longer? Would he have made different decisions, or perhaps avoided some of the military blunders that ultimately led to his defeat? These are questions that will never have definitive answers, but they serve as an important reminder of the cost of leadership and the human limits that even the greatest minds cannot escape. As we look at the history of Napoleon's reign and eventual fall, we are left with one poignant question. What price did he ultimately pay for his refusal to rest? For his single-minded drive to conquer and control? Was it worth it? And what lessons can we take from his story as we reflect on the limits of power, the importance of self-care, and the delicate balance between ambition and the need for rest? Franklin Pierce, the 14th President of the United States, is often remembered for his political missteps, his role in the turbulent years leading up to the Civil War, and his personal tragedies. However, one aspect of Pierce's life that is often overlooked is his relationship with sleep. Unlike many other historical figures whose lives were defined by sleepless nights and relentless ambition, Pierce's struggles with rest seem more personal, an ongoing battle between a troubled mind and the physical need for rest. Pierce's presidency from 1853 to 1857 was marked by increasing national tension over slavery and the question of how the United States would confront the issue of expansion. Yet, it was also a time of profound personal tragedy for Pierce. In 1853, shortly before his inauguration, his young son Benjamin died in a horrific train accident. The death of his son would haunt Pierce for the rest of his life and significantly impact his ability to cope with the demands of the presidency. This deep grief, compounded by his inability to rest, made Pierce's time in office a personal struggle as much as a political one. Though Pierce was known to sleep relatively little, his sleep patterns were characterized by irregularity rather than a complete absence of rest. He struggled to find a balance between the duties of the presidency and his personal need for sleep. He often had trouble falling asleep, his mind racing with the weight of the nation's problems and his own personal anguish. Despite these challenges, Pierce did sleep, though his rest was frequently interrupted by dreams filled with grief and the overwhelming demands of his office. Pierce's nights were often disrupted by his role in overseeing the ongoing issues with the expansion of the country, including the Kansas-Nebraska Act, which further fueled the debate over slavery. The act, which allowed settlers in the territories of Kansas and Nebraska to decide for themselves whether they would permit slavery, ignited violent conflicts known as Bleeding Kansas. The stress and responsibility of dealing with these national crises only added to Pierce's inability to rest. Reports from those close to him indicate that while he would try to sleep, his mind was often too consumed with worry, leaving him awake far longer than he intended. What made Pierce's sleep habits particularly challenging was not just his inability to fall asleep or stay asleep, but the psychological toll his presidency took on him. The death of his son weighed heavily on him throughout his presidency, and his inability to come to terms with his grief manifested in his sleep difficulties. The combination of personal and political pressure, coupled with his inability to find rest, contributed to a man who was emotionally and physically exhausted. Pierce's struggles with sleep were not simply a result of political stress. They were tied to the deep grief he carried every day. The presidency, which demanded Pierce's constant attention, further disrupted his already fragile sleep patterns. The decisions that came with leading the nation through one of the most divisive periods in its history were not easily made. Pierce, unable to properly rest, became increasingly susceptible to poor decision-making and emotional instability. While he maintained a public facade of composure, privately, he was burdened by his lack of rest, both physically and mentally. As we look at Pierce's presidency and his personal struggles with sleep, we are left to wonder, how much did the toll of sleep deprivation and unresolved grief contribute to the decisions he made, especially concerning the escalating tensions surrounding slavery and the growing division between the North and South? Could a well-rested president have navigated the complex issues of his time with more clarity and effectiveness? What impact did Pierce's personal pain and his struggle for rest have on his ability to lead during such a critical moment in American history? Franklin Pierce's time in office was marked not only by political challenges, but also by a profound internal struggle. His personal grief over the death of his son, compounded by the burdens of leadership, made him ill-suited for the pressures of the presidency. Unlike many of his contemporaries, who were driven by a tireless ambition or a sense of mission, Pierce was often overwhelmed by a combination of national turmoil and personal tragedy. His sleep, or lack thereof, was a direct reflection of this constant tension. In the political sphere, Pierce found himself at the center of an increasingly divided nation. The Kansas-Nebraska Act, which he championed, only served to further inflame sectional tensions between the North and the South. The violence that erupted in Kansas, where pro-slavery and anti-slavery factions clashed, became a symbol of the nation's inability to resolve its differences peacefully. The pressures of trying to hold the Union together during such a volatile time weighed heavily on Pierce, further exacerbating his personal struggle to manage his emotions and his rest. Sleep, which should have been a respite from the constant anxieties of leadership, was instead a source of frustration for Pierce. His mind was never at ease. As a result, his hours of rest were often few and far between. While some leaders managed to compartmentalize the stress of their roles, Pierce could not escape the constant barrage of decisions that needed to be made, the divisions that needed to be healed, and the personal sorrow that seemed to define his presidency. Reports from his contemporaries suggest that Pierce's political decisions were often swayed by his inability to find clarity in the midst of his emotional turmoil. His grief over the loss of his son was always present, lingering in the background of his presidency. This deep, unresolved sadness left him vulnerable to the emotional strain of leadership, and it affected his ability to make objective decisions. For example, his steadfast support of the Kansas-Nebraska Act and his handling of the conflicts in Kansas were criticized as being too focused on maintaining political unity rather than addressing the moral questions surrounding slavery. It's possible that his lack of sleep, compounded by the emotional weight of his grief, clouded his judgment and made him less capable of responding to the mounting national crisis. The problem with Pierce's sleep was not merely that he couldn't rest. It was that his inability to find relief from his anxiety exacerbated his personal isolation. The presidency required him to make decisions in a vacuum of sorts, where the weight of responsibility fell squarely on his shoulders. His relationship with his wife Jane was strained during this time, as she too was mourning the loss of their son. Pierce's mental and emotional state affected his relationship with those around him, and his lack of sleep only deepened his isolation. Sleep deprivation, in this case, was not a simple matter of physical exhaustion. It became a psychological barrier that prevented Pierce from functioning at his best. His leadership, while well-intentioned, became increasingly marked by indecision and poor judgment. His inability to rest left him emotionally drained, and as his presidency progressed, it became clear that he was not equipped to handle the deepening national crisis. The strain of his office and his inability to cope with personal grief and political stress took their toll on his mental health, and Pierce became increasingly disengaged from the realities of governance. As Pierce continued in office, his inability to find rest began to impact his ability to govern effectively. The pressure to maintain unity in a nation that seemed on the brink of civil war was enormous, and Pierce's sleep struggles only intensified his inability to lead. It was during this period that his presidency began to unravel. His disconnection from both his own personal grief and the needs of the nation made it difficult for him to make the difficult decisions that were required of him. Pierce's legacy, shaped by this internal battle, is often one of missed opportunities and misguided decisions. What is perhaps most telling about Pierce's presidency is the fact that he never truly recovered from the personal loss he experienced. While he continued to serve in office, his inability to cope with his grief, coupled with his ongoing struggles with sleep, prevented him from being the effective leader that the country needed. His decision to not seek re-election in 1856, after serving only one term, speaks to the immense toll that his presidency had taken on him. The pressure, the grief, and the inability to rest had led to a man who was physically and emotionally exhausted, unable to continue the work that he had once hoped would define his legacy. Would Pierce have been more effective if he had been able to find peace, both personally and physically? Would a better rested president have been able to navigate the complexities of his time with more clarity and resolve? His legacy, shaped in part by his personal struggles with grief and rest, raises the question of how much sleep deprivation, combined with personal pain, can affect the decisions of even the most well-meaning leaders. With this reflection on Pierce's presidency, we can now begin to consider how his lack of rest and the burden of personal loss played a part in shaping the future of the nation. Would a different president, well-rested and emotionally sound, have been able to prevent the deepening divisions that eventually led to the Civil War? Franklin Pierce's presidency, like many before him, is a reflection of the intense pressures that come with leadership. For Pierce, those pressures were heightened by the immense personal grief over the loss of his son, the weight of a divided nation, and the very real consequences of his inability to rest. While historians often focus on Pierce's political decisions, his struggles with sleep, combined with the emotional toll of his personal life, offer a deeper insight into how the personal and political are often inextricably linked. The inability to find rest, both physically and emotionally, played a pivotal role in his eventual failure as president. The Kansas-Nebraska Act of 1854, one of Pierce's most controversial decisions, is perhaps the clearest example of how his emotional state and lack of rest affected his judgment. The act, which allowed for the expansion of slavery into territories previously closed to it, deeply divided the nation. While Pierce believed it was a necessary step to preserve the Union, it sparked violence and chaos in Kansas. as pro- and anti-slavery factions clashed in what became known as Bleeding Kansas. Pierce, already emotionally drained from the loss of his son, struggled to manage the mounting political fallout. His personal grief and the pressure of his office left him unable to fully grasp the magnitude of the consequences of his decisions. His response to the violence in Kansas was tepid at best. He seemed unwilling or unable to take decisive action to quell the conflict, which led many to question his leadership. The inability to rest, compounded by the unhealed grief of losing a child, left Pierce disoriented and indecisive at a time when clarity and resolution were essential. In addition to the national crises, Pierce's personal struggles made it even harder for him to deal with the everyday demands of the presidency. His deep sorrow over the death of Benjamin was a constant presence, and it eroded his ability to engage with the critical issues of his time. His inability to sleep well exacerbated the emotional pain he was experiencing. The lack of restful sleep impaired his decision-making, and his deepening sense of isolation only intensified the toll his presidency took on him. Pierce's leadership style, characterized by indecision and emotional withdrawal, became more apparent as his term wore on. His colleagues in Washington, including members of his own party, began to see his lack of sleep and the toll it was taking on him. Yet, there was little that could be done. The combination of personal grief, sleep deprivation, and the overwhelming pressures of leading a nation on the brink of war created a perfect storm of failure. While Pierce was not inept or lazy, his emotional and physical exhaustion kept him from rising to the moment. By the time the 1856 election rolled around, Pierce had become a political liability. His presidency was marked by missed opportunities, and his inability to lead with clarity had significantly damaged his reputation. The Democratic Party, which had once rallied around him, distanced itself from him, choosing James Buchanan as the candidate for the upcoming election. Pierce, deeply aware of his shortcomings, withdrew from the political scene. His decision to not seek re-election was both a personal and a political one, as he realized that he was no longer the leader the country needed. In the aftermath of his presidency, Pierce would live a life marked by regret and personal reflection. He withdrew from the public eye, his health deteriorating as he struggled with the lingering effects of his time in office. He became a man disillusioned by his inability to heal from the wounds of his personal life and the pressures of his presidency. His decision to step back from politics was not just about his failure as a leader. It was a recognition of the toll that the presidency had taken on him, a toll that was magnified by his sleep deprivation and personal grief. Looking back on Pierce's presidency, it is clear that the impact of his struggles with sleep went far beyond the loss of a few hours of rest each night. The inability to rest and the mental and emotional exhaustion that came with it shaped his decision-making and ultimately contributed to his political downfall. The lack of sleep, combined with his personal grief, made it impossible for Pierce to govern effectively. His inability to manage his own health and emotions created a presidency that was marked by indecision, missed opportunities, and failure to act decisively when the nation needed strong leadership. Pierce's story offers a poignant reminder of the human costs of leadership. The presidency is not just about making decisions, it is also about maintaining one's physical, mental, and emotional health. Franklin Pierce's failure to recognize the importance of rest, coupled with the unresolved grief of his son's death, ultimately led to his inability to rise to the challenges of his time. His presidency became a cautionary tale of how the personal and political are intertwined, and how neglecting one's health can have far-reaching consequences. Would Pierce have been remembered differently if he had been able to cope with his grief, to find time to rest and to make decisions with a clearer mind? It's a question that remains unanswered, but it's clear that his inability to find rest contributed to the unraveling of his presidency and the increasing fragmentation of the nation. Thus, we come to the end of Franklin Pierce's story. His legacy, marked by personal tragedy and political missteps, serves as a reminder that even the best-intentioned leaders can falter when overwhelmed by the weight of their own lives and the responsibilities they carry. Winston Churchill, the iconic British Prime Minister, is known for his leadership during the Second World War, his speeches that rallied a nation, and his indomitable will to confront the Axis powers. However, there was another side to Churchill that is often overlooked: his relationship with sleep. Churchill's nocturnal habits were a reflection of both his profound work ethic and his need for personal isolation. Sleep, for Churchill, was not just about rest. It was a necessary escape, a time for him to think, to create, and to recharge in solitude. Throughout his career, Churchill was known for his irregular sleep schedule. His days were filled with meetings, speeches, and military strategy, while his nights were often filled with reflection, writing, and solitary thought. He was a man who thrived under pressure, and unlike many of his contemporaries, saw the night as a time to work. Churchill's need for isolation in the late hours of the evening was not just about getting work done, it was about finding peace away from the constant demands of leadership. It is often said that Churchill operated on a unique schedule, rising late in the morning and working well into the night. His days would typically begin at around 9 a.m. or later, and he would work until 2 a.m. or even later, immersed in correspondence, reading reports, and writing speeches. His ability to function with so little sleep was a testament to his extraordinary resilience, but it also reflects his personal need for time alone. The late hours were when Churchill could escape the pressures of leadership and focus on his own thoughts without interruption. Churchill's nocturnal habits were not purely a reflection of his work ethic, but also of his need for privacy and control over his time. As a leader, he was constantly surrounded by advisors, staff, and the public, all demanding his attention. But during the night, he could retreat into his own world, where he had the space to think freely, to strategize, and to prepare for the coming challenges. The isolation he found during these late hours allowed him to gather his thoughts and replenish his energy, albeit in a way that was unconventional for most leaders. Despite his late-night schedule, Churchill did manage to sleep, albeit in short bursts. It was said that he took naps during the day, and that his nights were frequently interrupted by the need for sleep. Yet these naps were more of a form of respite than deep rest. They allowed him to recharge for the long nights ahead. Churchill believed that the ability to work at night and to reflect during the quiet of the evening was a vital part of his ability to lead. However, Churchill's sleep habits were not without consequences. His constant need for isolation and his long hours of work meant that he often sacrificed the rest he needed to maintain his health. Reports from his doctors and colleagues indicated that his health was a concern throughout his career. Churchill's physical health, particularly in the later years of his life, began to show signs of strain. Despite his remarkable ability to push through fatigue, the toll of years of sleepless nights and relentless work began to take its toll. The question that arises is whether Churchill's sleep deprivation had any long-term effects on his decision-making. While his leadership was undeniably effective during some of the darkest hours of the war, could his lack of sleep have affected his clarity of thought or his ability to make sound decisions during times of extreme pressure? Was his nocturnal work schedule a sign of brilliance, or was it a contributing factor to his eventual physical decline? As we examine Churchill's nightly habits, we begin to see the complexity of his relationship with sleep. It was not simply about being a workaholic. It was about finding a space for himself, a time when he could think deeply and act decisively. But what did this lack of proper rest cost him in terms of his health, his relationships, and his ability to lead effectively? As Winston Churchill steered Britain through the dark days of World War II, his ability to function on little sleep became both a symbol of his resilience and a testament to his dedication to the cause. During the most critical moments of the war, when the survival of Britain hung in the balance, Churchill's sleepless nights were an integral part of his leadership style. Yet, while his constant drive and determination served to inspire the British people, they also took a significant toll on his physical and mental well-being. Churchill's sleep deprivation during the war years was not merely a personal quirk. It was a byproduct of the pressure and urgency that came with his role as Prime Minister. With the Axis powers advancing across Europe and the looming threat of invasion, Churchill felt an almost overwhelming sense of responsibility. Each day brought new challenges, new decisions to be made, and new battles to be fought, both on the battlefield and in the halls of power. In these circumstances, sleep became a secondary concern. What mattered was the ability to make quick decisions, to inspire the nation, and to keep the war effort moving forward. During the early years of the war, Churchill's daily routine was filled with a relentless cycle of work. He would typically rise late in the morning, around 9 or 10 a.m., and work through the day into the late evening. His nights were often filled with correspondence, strategic planning, and the reading of military reports. He would sometimes even dictate his thoughts to his secretaries during the night, drafting speeches, letters, and memos. Despite the demands on his time, Churchill maintained that he could function on only a few hours of sleep. His famous statement, "I can sleep when I am dead," became emblematic of his no-nonsense attitude toward rest. However, this schedule of minimal sleep and intense work came with consequences. Churchill's health, while strong in his younger years, began to show signs of strain during the war. His doctors frequently expressed concern about the toll that his sleepless nights were taking on his body. Churchill, ever the determined leader, often brushed off these concerns, believing that his work was more important than any temporary physical discomfort. He was, after all, in the midst of guiding Britain through its most perilous time in modern history. One of the most significant impacts of Churchill's sleep deprivation was on his mental state. While he was known for his sharp wit, his ability to inspire, and his tireless energy, there were moments when his lack of rest seemed to affect his clarity of thought. Reports from those close to him describe moments of irritability, mood swings, and a certain disorientation. On occasion, his speeches, so carefully crafted and passionately delivered, would show signs of being hastily prepared, a reflection of his mental fatigue. In addition, the stress of overseeing military strategy, managing diplomatic relationships, and addressing the home front took its toll on his emotional well-being. Churchill was deeply affected by the death toll of the war, particularly the heavy losses suffered during the Battle of Britain and the bombing raids on London. The trauma of seeing his country suffer under relentless attack while struggling with personal exhaustion led to moments of emotional strain. It is said that he would sometimes burst into tears after particularly difficult meetings, overcome by the weight of his decisions and the lives at stake. His lack of sleep, combined with the constant stress, undoubtedly contributed to his emotional vulnerability. Despite these challenges, Churchill's ability to function with minimal sleep and his tireless work ethic continued to serve him well during the war. His leadership was instrumental in rallying the British people, keeping the war effort going even when victory seemed uncertain. His speeches, particularly those delivered in the aftermath of critical battles, are still remembered for their ability to inspire courage and resilience in the face of adversity. Yet, the question remains, at what cost did Churchill's perseverance come? His physical health continued to deteriorate over time. In the later years of the war, his doctors became increasingly concerned about his weight and his tendency to neglect his health in favour of his work. Churchill was known to indulge in large meals, smoking cigars, and drinking alcohol, all of which compounded the effects of his lack of sleep. His medical team, particularly his physician Lord Moran, repeatedly urged him to take better care of himself, but Churchill was resolute in his belief that the war demanded his undivided attention. Looking back, it is evident that Churchill's decision to sacrifice sleep and his health in the service of his country was both admirable and costly. His leadership undoubtedly shaped the outcome of the war, but it also set the stage for physical decline. His later years were marked by a number of health problems, including strokes and bouts of depression, conditions that many historians attribute to the stresses of his wartime leadership. Churchill, ever the symbol of British resolve, paid a personal price for his dedication. The question that arises from Churchill's relationship with sleep is whether a more balanced approach might have allowed him to continue leading Britain effectively without compromising his health. Would a better rested Churchill have made even clearer, more strategic decisions? Could his health have been preserved if he had found a way to manage his time and energy more effectively? These questions remain unanswered, but they serve as a reminder of the hidden costs of leadership. Churchill's story also highlights the broader issue of leadership under extreme pressure. While many leaders throughout history have pushed themselves to the limits, Churchill's case raises the question of whether such dedication to a cause is sustainable in the long term. Can leaders who work relentlessly without rest maintain their effectiveness, or do they eventually burn out? With this reflection on Churchill's work habits and their impact, we can begin to see how his sleep deprivation, though seemingly a small part of his life, played a role in shaping his leadership and legacy. The sacrifices he made during the war, his physical health, his emotional well-being, and his sleep remind us that even the most steadfast leaders are human, vulnerable to the very forces they seek to overcome. Winston Churchill's life was marked by an unrelenting commitment to his nation, particularly during the darkest days of World War II. His tireless work ethic, unyielding determination, and ability to inspire a nation in the face of unimaginable adversity were central to his success as a leader. However, as we have seen, this drive came at the cost of his physical and mental health. The long nights, sleepless hours, and relentless pace he set for himself during the war left him physically exhausted and emotionally strained. Despite the heroism associated with his actions, the toll of such work habits eventually caught up with him. Churchill's determination to work through the night, drafting speeches, making military decisions, and reviewing reports, was a hallmark of his leadership style. It was said that Churchill was often in his study late into the evening, surrounded by papers and working through the complexities of war strategy, domestic issues, and international diplomacy. His routine was characterized by long hours of intense focus, interrupted only by brief naps during the day to regain some energy. For Churchill, sleep was not a priority. His work was. This dedication was fueled by a sense of urgency and responsibility, particularly after the outbreak of war. But while Churchill's late-night work habits contributed to the effectiveness of his leadership, they also left him physically drained. The constant lack of sleep, coupled with the stress of leading Britain through its most difficult period, began to take a significant toll on his health. Churchill's weight increased, his energy levels fluctuated, and his reliance on alcohol and cigarettes grew as ways to cope with the strain. His personal physician, Lord Moran, became increasingly concerned about his health, urging him to slow down and find time to rest. But Churchill, always focused on the greater cause, would not heed these warnings. One of the most striking aspects of Churchill's work habits was his ability to function despite the exhaustion. It is said that he would often work late into the night, dictating letters and reports even after most of his staff had retired for the evening. While others around him would rest, Churchill would continue his solitary work, which he saw as essential to maintaining the morale of the British people and winning the war. His sleepless nights became a badge of honour, a testament to his commitment to victory. However, the personal toll of these habits, both physically and mentally, was enormous. As the war continued, Churchill's health deteriorated. His physical condition became a concern, and his personal relationships also began to feel the strain. His wife, Clementine, was deeply worried about his health and frequently urged him to take better care of himself. She observed the toll his sleepless nights were taking on him and saw the changes in his temperament. His mood swings became more pronounced, and at times, his usual optimism seemed to fade. The burden of leadership, combined with his sleepless nights, weighed heavily on his mental state. Yet, despite the mounting health concerns, Churchill refused to slow down. The pressures of the war effort, the constant need for decisions, and his belief in his own role as the central figure in Britain's survival kept him from resting. He continued to work at a pace that was unsustainable for most people, let alone a man in his 60s. He was driven by a deep sense of duty, but that sense of responsibility, which had served him so well, also contributed to his eventual physical decline. After the war, Churchill's health continued to decline. The years of constant stress and sleep deprivation left him vulnerable to the effects of aging. He suffered from strokes and experienced periods of depression, which some attribute to the accumulated stress of his wartime leadership. His ability to bounce back after the war, to maintain his role as a political leader and public figure, was hindered by the toll of his intense work habits. Though he remained active in politics, his health no longer allowed him to lead with the same vigour as before. Churchill's case raises an important question about the limits of human endurance. How much can one person sacrifice in the name of duty before the costs become too high? Churchill's leadership was undoubtedly instrumental in the outcome of World War II, but his sleepless nights and relentless work ethic left him physically compromised and emotionally drained. The very traits that made him a hero also made him vulnerable. Could Churchill have been an even more effective leader if he had taken better care of his health? Would his impact on the war effort have been greater if he had been able to rest more, to step away from the demands of leadership for a while? The question remains unanswered, but it's clear that the balance between personal well-being and leadership is delicate. Churchill, for all his brilliance and determination, paid a heavy price for his work habits. As we reflect on Winston Churchill's life, it's important to consider not just his achievements, but also the personal costs of his leadership. His heroic efforts during World War II were inextricably linked to his tireless work ethic and his sleepless nights. But in the end, even the most steadfast leaders are subject to the same limits as the rest of us. Mental fatigue, physical exhaustion, and the toll of unrelenting pressure. Churchill's story is both one of triumph and tragedy, a reminder of the hidden costs of leadership and the importance of finding balance in the face of overwhelming responsibility. With Churchill's life and legacy in mind, we are left with a final thought. How can we, as individuals, leaders, and citizens, learn from his example? How can we better balance our own commitments with the need to care for our health and well-being, recognizing that without rest, even the strongest among us may eventually falter. Woodrow Wilson, the 28th President of the United States, is often celebrated for his role in guiding the nation through World War I and shaping the post-war peace. His leadership and vision for a more just world were instrumental in the creation of the League of Nations and the Treaty of Versailles. However, what is often overlooked is the immense personal toll this leadership took on him, particularly when it came to his sleep habits. Like many wartime leaders, Wilson found himself pulled in countless directions, balancing military strategy, international diplomacy, and the delicate matter of maintaining morale at home. In the process, his ability to rest became increasingly compromised, and his health, both physical and mental, began to deteriorate. Wilson's sleep troubles began long before the war. As a scholar, an academic, and later as president, Wilson was a man deeply committed to his work. His routine was demanding even before the war, filled with long hours of reading, writing, and attending meetings. But with the outbreak of World War I in 1914, his sleep habits became even more disrupted. The constant pressure of managing the war effort, as well as navigating the complexities of diplomacy with European powers, placed Wilson in an unrelenting cycle of work that left him with little time to rest. During the early years of the war, Wilson's schedule became more erratic. His days began early and ended late, often filled with meetings with military leaders, political advisors, and foreign dignitaries. These extended hours of decision-making, along with the stress of managing a war, meant that sleep was pushed further down his list of priorities. Wilson believed that his responsibilities as president were paramount, and he devoted himself fully to the task at hand. The mounting demands of war and diplomacy left him little time for personal respite, and his health began to suffer as a result. By 1917, when the United States officially entered the war, Wilson's workload had reached a breaking point. He was overseeing not only the military mobilization of the country, but also preparing to negotiate with European powers on how the post-war world would look. His role in the war effort required long hours spent in meetings, writing speeches, and engaging in correspondence, all while maintaining his public persona as the steadfast leader of a nation at war. Despite the growing pressure, Wilson pushed through, often working late into the night and skipping meals in favor of more work. Yet, it was during this period that the physical toll of his sleeplessness began to show. His health, which had once been strong, started to decline. Wilson's appetite waned, and he became increasingly fatigued. He relied heavily on stimulants like coffee and the occasional nap to keep himself awake during the long hours. But these short-term solutions only served to mask the deeper effects of his sleep deprivation. His aides began to worry about his well-being, noting that the president's energy seemed to be waning, and his once steady resolve appeared to be faltering. But Wilson, deeply focused on his work, refused to slow down. He pushed himself relentlessly, believing that the fate of the world rested on his shoulders. Wilson's sleepless nights and relentless work routine were compounded by his obsession with his vision for peace. As the war dragged on and the need for a diplomatic solution became more urgent, Wilson's involvement in the creation of the League of Nations became a central focus. He poured countless hours into drafting the terms of the post-war settlement, often working through the night to finish speeches and policy documents. His drive to shape the future of the world seemed inexhaustible, but in reality, the toll on his body and mind was growing more severe by the day. The question that arises from Wilson's sleepless nights is whether his inability to rest affected his decision-making. While he remained committed to his ideals, his health continued to deteriorate. his colleagues began to express concern about his ability to make decisions under such stress. Some historians speculate that Wilson's declining health, exacerbated by his lack of sleep, may have contributed to some of the more controversial decisions of his presidency, particularly in relation to the peace treaty negotiations and his insistence on the creation of the League of Nations, even in the face of domestic opposition. Wilson's struggles with sleep were not merely a matter of physical exhaustion. They were also tied to the intense pressure he felt as a leader at war. His sense of duty and responsibility drove him to neglect his own well-being in service to his vision for peace. But in the process, he paid a price. His health deteriorated rapidly, and by the end of the war, it was clear that Wilson's body had begun to break down under the strain. As we move forward, we'll explore how the effects of his sleep deprivation became even more evident in the later years of his presidency, particularly after the war ended, and he faced the political battles of selling the Treaty of Versailles and the League of Nations to a reluctant Senate. By 1919, as the Treaty of Versailles was being negotiated, Woodrow Wilson's physical and mental health had significantly deteriorated. The demands of leading the United States through World War I, combined with his relentless work ethic and inability to rest, had taken a toll on him. The strain of these responsibilities, particularly in negotiating a post-war peace settlement, combined with his sleep deprivation, ultimately led to a dramatic decline in his health and capacity to lead. Wilson had always been a man of unyielding determination, but the task of negotiating peace after the war proved to be overwhelming. The Treaty of Versailles, which would officially end the war, was a pivotal moment not only for Europe, but also for Wilson's health and legacy. As president, Wilson saw the treaty negotiations as a defining moment, one where his vision for a post-war world centered on the creation of the League of Nations would be realized. He devoted himself to the treaty process, spending long hours in meetings with foreign leaders, drafting speeches, and negotiating the terms of the settlement. For him, the success of the treaty was not just a matter of diplomacy, but a matter of personal duty. His belief in the importance of the League of Nations was unshakable, and he poured all his energy into convincing others of its necessity. However, the demands of these negotiations came at a significant personal cost. Wilson was already physically exhausted from the years of managing the war effort, but now the mental strain of the peace talks added another layer of pressure. His insomnia and fatigue were compounded by the stress of trying to reconcile the conflicting interests of the various powers involved in the negotiations. The late nights continued, as did his marathon work sessions, with little regard for his health. He was frequently seen pacing the halls of the Versailles Palace or seated at his desk, drafting documents and writing speeches, long after his staff had retired for the night. The pressure was immense, and despite the toll it was taking on him, Wilson was unable to slow down. At the same time, the political opposition at home to the League of Nations was growing stronger. The Senate, led by isolationists, began to question the validity of Wilson's vision for international cooperation. His health, already fragile, began to decline further as he struggled to maintain control of the treaty's ratification process. The battle over the League of Nations became increasingly bitter, and Wilson's refusal to compromise on the issue led to a political deadlock. At the height of this struggle, in the midst of the treaty's debates, Wilson suffered a severe stroke in October 1919. The stroke left Wilson incapacitated and unable to fully engage in the political battles that followed. His health had deteriorated to the point where he was no longer able to lead in the way he once had. For several months, he was virtually isolated from the public, and his ability to continue leading the country was severely compromised. Despite the severity of his condition, Wilson continued to push for his version of the treaty. but his physical and mental decline had made him unable to effectively navigate the political landscape. The treaty, which Wilson had worked so tirelessly to shape, was ultimately rejected by the Senate in 1920. His health, exacerbated by his sleep deprivation and unrelenting work habits, had made him unable to sway the opposition. Wilson's stroke and the ensuing health crisis marked the end of his political career. His presidency, which had been defined by his leadership during the war and his post-war peace efforts, became a cautionary tale of the limits of personal endurance. The collapse of the Treaty of Versailles, along with his inability to secure support for the League of Nations, cast a shadow over his legacy. While he had succeeded in many ways during the war, the toll it took on him personally left him vulnerable and unable to achieve the full vision he had for the world. The irony of his presidency was that Wilson had sacrificed his health, his very ability to lead, in pursuit of a vision for peace, only to see that vision falter because he was too physically drained to push it through. What we see in Wilson's later years is the tragic intersection of ambition, duty, and the human need for rest. His belief in the importance of the League of Nations and the treaty was so strong that he was willing to sacrifice his own well-being to see it realized. But the strain of these efforts, combined with his chronic lack of sleep, proved to be too much. Wilson's failure to prioritize his health ultimately led to a breakdown in his ability to lead the nation during one of the most important moments in history. His story raises questions about the costs of leadership and the balance between personal sacrifice and the need for self-care. Could a healthier Wilson have succeeded in securing the treaty and ensuring that the League of Nations was a cornerstone of international relations? It's impossible to know for certain, but it's clear that his lack of rest, combined with the physical and emotional exhaustion of his role, played a key part in his downfall. The collapse of the treaty negotiations and the failure of the League of Nations were deeply disheartening for Wilson, and they marked the end of his political influence. He would live the rest of his life in relative seclusion, largely estranged from the political world he had once dominated. The dream he had worked so tirelessly to achieve was not realized during his lifetime, and much of his later life was spent reflecting on what might have been. As we reflect on the toll of Wilson's leadership, it is clear that his sleep deprivation was more than just a personal challenge. It was a contributing factor in the ultimate failure of his most cherished goals. His inability to rest, to prioritize his own health, and to find balance in his life left him vulnerable at a time when he needed to be at his best. Wilson's story serves as a powerful reminder of the human cost of ambition and the importance of self-care, especially for those who carry the weight of leadership on their shoulders. Woodrow Wilson's presidency left an indelible mark on both the United States and the world. He led the nation through the turmoil of World War I, crafted a vision for international peace that would shape global diplomacy, and played a pivotal role in the creation of the League of Nations. Yet, the personal cost of his tireless leadership, particularly his sleepless nights and relentless work ethic, cannot be overstated. As we reflect on Wilson's legacy, we must consider how his physical and mental decline, exacerbated by years of inadequate rest, affected his ability to achieve his goals and shaped his later years. After suffering the stroke in 1919, Wilson's health was forever altered. The once vibrant president who had led the United States to victory in World War I became a shadow of his former self. Though he continued to live for nearly 3 more years, his public influence and political effectiveness were dramatically diminished. The stroke left him physically incapacitated, and the emotional toll of his failure to pass the Treaty of Versailles and secure the League of Nations left a permanent mark on his psyche. Wilson's inability to rest during the critical years of His presidency had a profound effect on his ability to lead effectively, and the events that unfolded during and after the war underscored the consequences of his sleep deprivation. His refusal to prioritize his health, despite repeated warnings from his physicians and family, left him vulnerable to illness and emotional strain. The stroke, which incapacitated him for months, marked the tragic culmination of a period of unsustainable work habits. During his recovery, Wilson was forced to confront the reality of his physical decline. The stroke left him unable to engage fully in the political process, and his inability to recover completely meant that his vision for the post-war world remained unrealized during his lifetime. The United States, under his leadership, had played a central role in the war effort, but Wilson's failure to secure the League of Nations and the peace treaty left the country isolated from the international community after the war. Wilson's health also affected his relationships with those around him. His wife Edith, who had been a key source of support during his presidency, became his caretaker after his stroke. Their relationship, once filled with mutual respect and shared purpose, was now burdened with the challenges of caring for a debilitated leader. Wilson's inability to lead effectively during the final years of his presidency also placed a strain on the Democratic Party, which struggled to find a successor who could carry out his vision. What is perhaps most poignant about Wilson's legacy is the tragic irony that his inability to rest and care for his own health directly contributed to the failure of the very vision he had worked so tirelessly to achieve. His insistence on pushing forward without regard for his well-being, driven by a sense of duty and the enormity of the global challenges he faced, left him physically shattered and unable to complete the work he had set out to do. The Treaty of Versailles, which Wilson had worked so tirelessly to shape, was ultimately rejected by the US Senate. The League of Nations, which he had seen as the key to future peace, faltered without American support, and the world's hopes for lasting international cooperation were dashed. Wilson's story is a cautionary tale about the human cost of ambition, the limits of endurance, and the importance of rest. He was driven by an unwavering belief in the righteousness of his cause and the need for global cooperation. Yet, his refusal to acknowledge the toll that years of sleepless nights and intense pressure had taken on him prevented him from fully realizing his vision. The ultimate failure of his peace initiatives, combined with the physical collapse of his body, left a complex legacy, one that is remembered for both its ambition and its tragic limitations. In the years following Wilson's stroke, his health continued to decline, and he lived a largely reclusive life until his death in 1924. His post-presidential years were marked by reflection and regret. He had given everything for the causes he believed in, but in the process, he had lost the ability to fully lead, and his health had suffered irreparably. Wilson's final years were a quiet, reflective end to a presidency that had begun with such promise and ended in such personal and political tragedy. In reflecting on the end of Wilson's presidency, we are left with a question that echoes through the ages. How do leaders balance the demands of duty with the need for rest and recovery? Wilson's story serves as a powerful reminder that even the most brilliant and driven individuals are vulnerable to the physical and emotional toll of unrelenting work. The price of leadership, as Wilson's life demonstrates, is not only measured in the victories achieved, but also in the toll it takes on one's health, relationships, and legacy. Ultimately, Wilson's health struggles and their impact on his ability to lead have become an enduring part of his legacy. His tireless work to shape the future of the world and his belief in the importance of peace and diplomacy stand as testament to his dedication. Yet, his inability to rest, to care for his body and mind, speaks to the limits of human endurance and the cost of leadership. As we close this chapter on Woodrow Wilson, we are left with a thought that transcends his story. What is the true cost of leadership, and how can we learn from the sacrifices of those who have given everything for their vision? Is it possible to achieve greatness without paying such a heavy price? Theodore Roosevelt, the 26th President of the United States, was a man of boundless energy and extraordinary ambition. Known for his exuberant personality, his daring spirit, and his remarkable accomplishments, Roosevelt's life was characterized by an insatiable desire to achieve and explore. Yet beneath the surface of his vigorous pursuits, Roosevelt's relationship with sleep was far from healthy. His constant drive for personal and professional success often came at the cost of his rest, leaving him physically exhausted and mentally strained. His life offers a fascinating glimpse into the tension between ambition and well-being. How far can a person push themselves before the weight of their own expectations leads to physical and emotional exhaustion? Roosevelt's sleep struggles were evident early in his life. As a child, he was frail and sickly, suffering from asthma and other health issues. However, instead of succumbing to these weaknesses, he threw himself into physical activity, determined to overcome his ailments. His drive to build strength and resilience led him to embrace a vigorous lifestyle, hiking, boxing, and horseback riding. This pattern of pushing his limits extended into his adult life, particularly during his time as president. His unyielding work ethic, which was often praised, became a double-edged sword that left him little time to rest. As president, Roosevelt's schedule was notoriously demanding. He woke early in the morning to begin his work and rarely allowed himself more than a few hours of sleep each night. His days were filled with meetings, speeches, and other presidential duties, while his nights were often spent catching up on paperwork, reading reports, or engaging in personal projects. Roosevelt, who had a deep fascination with history and literature, would often read late into the night, neglecting the rest that his body desperately needed. Roosevelt's need for constant activity extended beyond his official duties as president. He was always pursuing new adventures, whether it was writing books, exploring uncharted territories, or working on his ranch in the Badlands of South Dakota. His restlessness seemed to know no bounds, and he often regarded sleep as a necessary evil rather than a crucial component of maintaining his health and energy. His impatience with anything that slowed him down, including the need for sleep, became a defining characteristic of his personality. This relentless drive for achievement was fueled by Roosevelt's desire to leave a legacy. He viewed his time in office as an opportunity to reshape the nation and make it stronger, fairer, and more just. He tackled the issues of trust-busting, conservation, and the expansion of American power with unparalleled zeal. But behind these accomplishments was a man who often ignored the toll that his lifestyle was taking on his physical and emotional well-being. Despite his outward confidence and vitality, Roosevelt's lack of sleep began to show signs of strain. He became prone to fatigue, irritability, and bouts of poor decision-making. His relentless pace often led to periods of exhaustion, and his colleagues began to notice that the president's mood could shift dramatically depending on how much rest he had gotten. Roosevelt was rarely seen without a determined look on his face, but those who knew him well understood the personal cost of his drive. His sleep deprivation, combined with his tendency to push through fatigue, created a man who was both inspiring and, at times, volatile. In this section, we see that Roosevelt's ambition and unyielding pursuit of achievement played a large role in his sleep struggles. While he was celebrated for his energy and accomplishments, the toll that his schedule took on his body and mind began to take its toll in ways that were less visible but no less significant. Roosevelt's life serves as a reminder that even the most driven individuals must recognize the importance of rest, and that the pursuit of greatness without consideration of personal well-being can come with lasting consequences. As we continue, we will explore how Roosevelt's sleep struggles affected his presidency, and his Theodore Roosevelt's presidency was marked by transformative changes, reforms in business, conservation of natural resources, and the expansion of American influence across the globe. Yet, despite these monumental achievements, Roosevelt's tireless work ethic, fueled by a constant push to do more, created both personal and professional challenges. His inability to prioritize rest, coupled with the physical and mental strain of his demanding schedule, eventually began to impact his ability to lead effectively and take care of his own health. Roosevelt's drive for action extended into every aspect of his life. From his early morning hours filled with intense activity to his late-night work sessions, Roosevelt operated at a pace that was unsustainable for most people. As president, he woke early, often before 6 a.m., to get a head start on the day. His routine was jam-packed with meetings, discussions, speeches, and decisions. By the end of the day, Roosevelt's energy was typically spent, yet he rarely allowed himself to rest for more than a few hours, often burning the candle at both ends. For Roosevelt, sleep was often viewed as an inconvenience, something to be endured rather than enjoyed. His mind was constantly racing with ideas, strategies, and projects, and this overdrive meant that rest simply wasn't a priority. One of the most significant effects of Roosevelt's work habits was the toll it took on his health. Despite his robust physical condition, built through years of vigorous exercise, his lack of sleep and constant stress eventually started to wear down his body. Roosevelt had suffered from various health problems throughout his life, including asthma and a near-fatal illness as a child. While he had long since overcome many of these challenges through sheer force of will, the demands of the presidency began to take a toll on his resilience. In 1902, Roosevelt's already strained health was further tested when he began experiencing persistent exhaustion, headaches, and physical fatigue. At one point, during a visit to the western United States, Roosevelt's physician advised him to slow down and take better care of his health. But Roosevelt's commitment to his duties was so strong that he ignored his doctor's advice. He continued to push forward with his packed schedule, unwilling to take the time he needed to recuperate. The constant pressure of managing the country, coupled with his personal desire to leave a lasting legacy, kept him on a grueling path of work and minimal rest. Roosevelt's sleep deprivation also had an impact on his decision-making. While his vision for the country remained clear, his inability to properly rest sometimes led him to make choices that reflected the exhaustion he was carrying. He became more irritable, his patience waned, and his decision-making process, though still sharp, was occasionally influenced by fatigue. His actions during the Panama Canal negotiations, for example, were sometimes seen as a reflection of his overwhelming desire to secure his place in history. Roosevelt's drive to complete the canal as part of his broader foreign policy agenda led him to overlook certain details and nuances in the negotiation process, a sign that the immense weight of his responsibilities was taking a toll on his ability to manage everything with precision. Roosevelt's relentless pace also affected his personal relationships. His family often saw him as distant, as his attention was almost entirely focused on his work. He was known to take brief moments to engage with his children, but the bulk of his energy and time was spent on his presidential duties. His wife, Edith, frequently worried about his health and well-being, urging him to take breaks and slow down. Yet, Roosevelt's determination to continue at full speed left little room for compromise. He was in many ways his own worst enemy, caught in a cycle of work that left him unable to find the balance he so desperately needed. While Roosevelt's presidency is often hailed as a period of significant progress for the United States, it's clear that the personal cost of his sleep struggles was high. Roosevelt's physical health continued to decline throughout his time in office, with periods of exhaustion and illness that were exacerbated by his overworked lifestyle. His constant sleep deprivation and lack of proper rest ultimately took a toll on his longevity as president. In 1909, after completing his second term, Roosevelt left office physically worn out, though he did not step away from public life completely. Instead, he continued to pursue his many interests, including a subsequent expedition to South America and a return to the political arena. Yet, even in his post-presidency years, his health continued to decline as a result of his relentless pace. Roosevelt's story serves as a powerful example of the limits of human endurance, even for someone as driven and resilient as he was. His ambition and vision for the country led to remarkable accomplishments, but his inability to rest and take care of his health became a defining feature of his presidency. The cost of this approach was not only physical fatigue, but also a strain on his emotional and mental well-being. Roosevelt's example offers valuable lessons about the balance between ambition and self-care. The price of leadership is steep, but it's important to remember that those who bear the weight of leadership must also find time to rest, recuperate, and recharge. In reflecting on Roosevelt's life, it becomes clear that his legacy is as much about his achievements as it is about the personal sacrifices he made along the way. His refusal to rest, to slow down, and to acknowledge his physical and mental limitations ultimately contributed to a diminished ability to lead effectively toward the end of his presidency. As we consider his story, we must ask ourselves, how can we balance the pursuit of greatness with the need for rest? And how can we ensure that our own ambitions do not come at the expense of our well-being? Theodore Roosevelt's incredible accomplishments as president and later as a statesman were inextricably linked to his larger-than-life persona, an image of strength, energy, and unyielding determination. Yet, beneath the vigorous exterior, Roosevelt's constant fatigue, stemming from his sleepless nights and relentless work ethic, played a subtle yet powerful role in shaping both his public image and his personal life. As we examine the later years of his presidency and his post-presidential endeavors, it becomes evident that his struggle with rest shaped not only the trajectory of his leadership, but also the way he was viewed by the American public. Roosevelt was a master at managing his public image. He built a reputation as a man of action, someone who was always in motion, whether that meant tackling the challenges of his presidency or engaging in outdoor adventures. His passion for nature and physical activity allowed him to project an image of vitality that resonated deeply with the American people. Roosevelt was often seen hunting, hiking, or exploring uncharted territories, and these activities seemed to counterbalance the exhaustion he quietly endured from his demanding schedule. For the public, he was a symbol of boundless energy, someone who could conquer any obstacle and achieve greatness no matter the cost. However, the public's perception of Roosevelt as a tireless and indomitable figure concealed the reality of his fatigue. The long hours, sleepless nights, and constant pressure to perform had a profound effect on his ability to manage his emotions, make critical decisions, and maintain his physical health. In the years leading up to his departure from the presidency, Roosevelt began to experience bouts of irritability and mood swings, which were, in part, the result of his chronic sleep deprivation. The man who had once been synonymous with unflagging energy was, in reality, running on fumes. Despite these signs of exhaustion, Roosevelt's persona remained one of invincibility. Even after his second term ended in 1909, he continued to pursue ambitious projects, including a trip to Africa, where he led an extensive safari and collected specimens for the Smithsonian Institution. While the trip was a grand adventure, it was also a way for Roosevelt to recover from the pressures of his presidency. However, the effects of his constant overwork followed him. His health, already compromised by years of pushing himself beyond reasonable limits, was further strained by the physical demands of the expedition. The fact that he continued to embrace such demanding challenges, even as his body showed signs of wear, speaks to the deeply ingrained work ethic that defined Roosevelt's life. Yet, it was also a stark reminder that even the most seemingly invincible leaders are susceptible to burnout. Roosevelt's post-presidential years also showcased how his fatigue and sleep struggles influenced his public life. In 1912, after a period of relative political quiet, Roosevelt launched a third-party campaign as the candidate for the Progressive Party. His platform, which championed a more direct form of democracy and government intervention in the economy, struck a chord with the American people. However, the campaign itself was exhausting. Roosevelt, now in his early 50s, was unable to sustain the rigorous pace he had once maintained during his presidency. The campaign trail, filled with constant speeches, rallies, and travel, pushed him to the limit. His physical health, already weakened by years of relentless activity, began to deteriorate further. Despite his fatigue, Roosevelt refused to step back. His health became a concern during the campaign, and at one point, he was shot in an assassination attempt while giving a speech in Milwaukee. Remarkably, he continued his speech after being shot, completing his address before seeking medical attention. This display of toughness and determination only further solidified his public persona as an unwavering figure of strength. Yet, it was also a telling example of how his work ethic and drive had blinded him to the physical limits of his body. Even after the shooting, Roosevelt continued to campaign vigorously, though the toll on his health was evident. Roosevelt's post-presidential years became a delicate balancing act between public expectations and his own physical limitations. His enduring commitment to public service, his refusal to acknowledge the need for rest, and his desire to maintain a larger-than-life image all contributed to his ongoing fatigue. While he remained one of the most beloved figures in American history, those closest to him knew that his health had been irreparably affected by his years of sleepless nights and constant work. In his final years, Roosevelt's health continued to decline, and he suffered from various ailments, including heart issues and the physical consequences of his earlier exhaustion. He passed away in 1919 at the age of 60, relatively young for someone of his stature and accomplishments. His death was a poignant reminder of the cost of his relentless work ethic. A work ethic that, while contributing to his success, also hastened the end of his life. The story of Theodore Roosevelt is one of triumph and tragedy, ambition and exhaustion. His public persona, built on a foundation of unyielding energy and determination, was at odds with the private reality of a man who, in his pursuit of greatness, had neglected his own well-being. Roosevelt's legacy is one of remarkable achievement, but it is also a cautionary tale of the price of constant overwork and sleep deprivation. His life reminds us that even the most driven leaders must recognize their own limitations, prioritize rest, and take care of their health, lest they risk burning out before they can complete the work they have set out to do. As we look back on Roosevelt's incredible achievements, we must also consider how the lack of rest and the physical toll of his work habits shaped both his life and his legacy. What could Roosevelt have achieved if he had allowed himself more time for recovery and respite? Would his impact on the world have been even greater had he not pushed himself to the brink of exhaustion? These questions are difficult to answer, but they serve as an important reflection on the relationship between ambition and well-being.